A car so cheap that it costs less than the tires on your pickup truck. Not a concept car. Not a prototype collecting dust in some museum. A real, running, breathing automobile, rolling off a real factory floor, sold to real families for $2,500 American dollars. Let that sink in. $2,500. That's less than what most of us spend on a set of custom wheels. Less than a weekend at a car show in Scottsdale. Less than the labor bill the last time someone touched your transmission. And yet, this car, this tiny, buzzing, rear-engine people mover, was supposed to change the world. It didn't. And the story of why it didn't is one of the most fascinating, heartbreaking, and deeply human tales in the entire history of the automobile. This is the story of the Tata Nano. You have to understand something about India in the early 2000s. The roads were different there. The traffic was different. The life on those roads was different from anything most Americans had ever seen or could picture. Picture a two-lane road somewhere outside Mumbai, crowded, loud, pulsing with heat. And in that traffic, weaving between trucks and rickshaws and stray dogs and honking buses, you'd see them everywhere. Families. On motorcycles. Not one person on a motorcycle. Not two. Families. A father driving. A mother sitting sideways behind him, because in Indian culture, women often ride side saddle. One child squeezed in between them, and sometimes another child perched on the handlebars up front. For human beings. One two-wheeled machine. Moving through traffic at highway speeds with nothing but open air and hope between them and the asphalt. A man named Ratan Tata saw this. And it broke his heart. Ratan Tata wasn't just any man. He was the chairman of Tata Sons, the conglomerate that ran one of India's most powerful industrial empires. Steel mills, hotels, software companies, and yes, automobiles. Tata Motors had been building trucks and commercial vehicles since the 1940s. They'd acquired brands, they'd built partnerships, they'd grown into a giant. But when Ratan Tata looked at those families on motorcycles, he didn't see a market opportunity first. He saw people. He saw vulnerability. He saw a father who loved his children and wanted to protect them, but who simply could not afford the one invention that would keep the rain off their heads and a steel cage around their bodies. He saw someone who needed a car but couldn't have one. And Ratan Tata made a promise. A deeply personal promise. He was going to build that family a car. A real car. Not a three-wheeler. Not a glorified golf cart. A proper four-wheeled automobile with an engine and a roof and 4 seats, and he was going to sell it for 1 lakh rupees. 100,000 Indian rupees. 1 lakh. At the time, that translated to approximately $2,000 American. The automotive world laughed. Industry analysts shook their heads. Engineers scratched their chins and said it simply couldn't be done. You couldn't build a safe, functioning, road-legal automobile for that price. Not in 2006. Not ever. The math didn't work. The physics didn't cooperate. The regulations wouldn't allow it. Ratan Tata had heard all of that before. He told his engineers to figure it out anyway. Now, here in America, we have a deep and abiding reverence for the automobile that goes back over 100 years. We love more. More horsepower. More chrome. More cubic inches. More cup holders. We are a country that looked at the muscle car era and said, yes, but can we make it louder? We put bigger engines in things that didn't need bigger engines. We put fins on sedans because fins looked fast. We put V8s in station wagons because we could. The Tata Nano was the absolute philosophical opposite of every single one of those impulses. The engineering team tasked with building this car didn't ask, what can we add? They asked one question, and they asked it about everything. Do we actually need this? And most of the time the answer was no. Take windshield wipers. Standard cars have 2. One sweeps left, one sweeps right. They overlap in the middle, and together they clear your entire field of vision in a heavy rain. The Nano's engineers looked at that system and asked their question. Do we actually need 2? They ran the math. They looked at the geometry of the windshield. They figured out that with one centrally mounted wiper arm and a specially designed blade, you could clear enough of the glass to drive safely. 1 wiper, not 2. Take the wheels. A standard car has 4 or 5 lug nuts holding each wheel to the hub. Those extra lug nuts are partly structural, partly redundant safety engineering, partly just the way it's always been done. The Nano's team asked their question. Do we actually need 5? They ran stress tests. They consulted with structural engineers. They determined that 3 lug nuts, properly torqued, would hold the wheels safely under the load this car would carry. 3 lug nuts per wheel, not 5. Take the rear view mirror. In America, you get a driver's side mirror, a passenger's side mirror, and your interior mirror. 3 mirrors minimum, often more on trucks. The base Nano? 1 mirror. Driver's side only. You want to know what's happening on your right? You turn your head.
Take the fuel cap.
That little threaded cap you unscrew every time you stop for gas.
Gone.
The Nano's fuel inlet was hidden under the front hood because the engine was in the rear, remember, and it used a simple flap system instead of a traditional cap. Cost savings, a few rupees. Multiplied across hundreds of thousands of cars. Real money. Take the trunk. In the original Nano, there was no trunk lid. The rear panel of the car was sealed. If you wanted to access the engine, which sat in the back, Volkswagen Beetle style, you had to fold down the rear seat from inside the cabin. There was no opening to the rear of the vehicle from outside. Full hatchback functionality didn't arrive until 2015, 7 years into the car's life. Take the engine itself. 2 cylinders. 624 cubic centimeters of total displacement. 312 cc per cylinder. To put that in American terms, we are talking about an engine roughly the size of 2 motorcycle cylinders bolted together. It made 38 horsepower. 38. In a country where a base trim pickup truck makes 300, this little engine was putting out less than most riding lawnmowers you'd find in a suburban garage. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets genuinely impressive from an engineering standpoint. Tata's team didn't just remove things randomly. They engineered with extraordinary precision. The car had an all-aluminum engine block, keeping weight down. It had Bosch fuel injection, a sophisticated modern system that maximized every drop of fuel it consumed. The result was a fuel economy figure that would make an American commuter weep with envy, over 60 miles per gallon by American measurement standards. 60
miles per gallon.
In a car with 4 seats, a roof, and a working heater. The development process generated 68 patents, 31 design patents, and 37 technology patents. These weren't patents on obvious things. These were genuine innovations, novel solutions to problems nobody had tried to solve before because nobody had ever been crazy enough to try to build a car this inexpensive before. The car's exterior and interior were designed not in India, but in Italy, at the Institute of Development in Automotive Engineering. The Nano, for all its cost-cutting, was shaped by the same country that gave the world Ferrari and Lamborghini. There's something almost poetic about that. The final vehicle weighed less than most Americans' dinner tables. It was small, shorter than a smart car, shorter than almost anything you'd see on a road in the United States. But it had 4 seats, 4 doors, 4 wheels, and a working engine. By any objective definition, it was a car. And Tata's engineers had figured out how to build it, start to finish, for 1 lakh rupees. The dream was real. Now came the hard part. In 2006, Tata Motors announced they had found a home for their revolutionary little car. Singapore, West Bengal, India. The state government, led at the time by a Communist Party administration, which, to American ears, sounds strange, partnered with a major industrial corporation, but Indian politics is a world unto itself, had arranged for a large tract of agricultural land to be acquired for the new factory. 997 acres. A massive, sprawling complex that would eventually employ thousands, produce hundreds of thousands of cars per year, and transform this corner of rural Bengal into an industrial powerhouse. The problem was the land. The land wasn't empty. It wasn't an abandoned factory site or a brownfield lot. It was farmland, fertile, productive agricultural land that families had been working for generations. And while the government had gone through the legal process of acquiring it, compensating landowners through eminent domain procedures, not everyone agreed that the process had been fair. Not everyone agreed that the compensation was adequate. And many of the farmers simply didn't want to sell. This was their land. Their families had worked it for as long as anyone could remember. No amount of money made giving it up acceptable. Protests began almost immediately. They grew. They intensified. Political opposition parties smelled blood in the water and threw their support behind the farmers. Demonstrations turned into blockades. The construction site became contested ground. And then a woman named Mamata Banerjee entered the picture. Banerjee was a firebrand opposition politician who would eventually become the chief minister of West Bengal. She took up the farmers' cause with absolute ferocity, staging hunger strikes, leading marches, and turning Singapore into a national political flashpoint. Tata Motors watched all of this with growing dread. They tried to hold on. They broke ground anyway. They began construction. They installed machinery. The Nano was supposed to launch in 2008, and the Singapore factory was the only facility ready to build it. But the protests didn't stop. They escalated. Workers were threatened. Supply chains were disrupted. And in September 2008, Ratan Tata made an announcement that shocked India. Tata Motors was leaving Singapore. They were pulling the entire operation, machinery, plans, workforce, everything, and starting over somewhere else. Within days, the neighboring state of Gujarat, led by a then relatively unknown regional politician named Narendra Modi, who would later become India's prime minister, rolled out the red carpet. Modi personally called Ratan Tata. He promised land, infrastructure support, subsidies, and a government that wanted Tata there. The new factory would be built in Sanand, Gujarat. The delay cost Tata over a year of lost production. It cost them the early momentum of their launch. It cost them hundreds of millions of dollars in relocation expenses and duplicated infrastructure investment. It stole the wind from the sails of what should have been a triumphant market debut. The Nano finally launched to the public on March 23, 2009. Not with a roar, with a stutter. The launch of the Tata Nano was a genuine media event of global proportions. American auto journalists flew to India. European newspapers ran front-page stories. Business schools around the world held seminars on what the Nano meant for emerging markets. The car appeared on magazine covers. Ratan Tata appeared on television programs from Mumbai to Manhattan. The world had decided that the Nano was more than a car. It was a symbol. It was proof that capitalism and engineering ingenuity could solve problems that aid organizations and governments had been struggling with for decades. It was going to put transportation within reach of hundreds of millions of people who had never been able to afford it. It was going to do for personal mobility what the mobile phone had done for communication, bring it down in cost so dramatically that an entirely new class of people could access it. In India, anticipation was at a fever pitch. The government created a special allocation system to manage demand. People registered to enter a lottery for the right to purchase a Nano. Hundreds of thousands of applications flooded in. And then the cars started shipping. And then the fire started. It began with isolated reports. A Nano catching fire while parked. A Nano engine compartment smoking after a short drive. Then more reports. Then a pattern began to emerge that was impossible to ignore. Tata's official response was carefully worded. The fires were caused by foreign electrical equipment, meaning aftermarket accessories, things that owners had added to their cars themselves that weren't part of the original design. The cars, Tata insisted, were not at fault. Some of the cases did involve owner modifications. Others were harder to explain away. The damage, though, wasn't primarily physical. The real fire was in the public's mind. In India, a car is not merely transportation. A car is status. A car is a declaration to your neighbors, your family, your community, about who you are and how far you've come. The motorcycle-riding middle class that Ratan Tata wanted to lift into car ownership didn't just want a car. They wanted a car that announced their arrival into a higher social stratum. And the Nano, cheap, small, buzzing, associated now with fire reports and cost-cutting jokes, was sending exactly the wrong message. A second-hand Maruti, an older, more established Indian brand, cost more than a Nano. But it looked like a real car. It had more features. It had an aura of normalcy. And in the brutal social calculus of aspiration, a used car with more prestige beat a new car with less. The Nano, almost from the moment it launched, became known as the poor man's car. And in a country where the middle class was desperately, urgently, achingly not trying to appear poor, where every rupee spent on status markers was a rupee well spent, being seen in a Nano became something to avoid rather than celebrate. The car that was supposed to carry 400 million people into a better life had become, in the public imagination, a symbol of not being able to afford anything better. This was the cruelest irony of the entire story. Let's talk about some numbers, because the numbers tell the story with a brutal clarity that words alone can't match. Tata Motors had projected production figures of 250,000 nanos per year. That was the plan they built the Sanand factory around. That was the throughput they needed to hit for the economics of the car to work. At 250,000 units per year, the Nano made sense. The cost per unit calculations worked out. The factory investment paid itself back. The whole project justified itself. In the first full fiscal year of sales, Tata sold approximately 70,000 nanos. Not 250,000. 70,000. A little more than a quarter of their target. A 2008 study by the respected Indian rating agency CRISIL had projected that the Nano would expand India's entire car market by 65%. 65%. The analysts believed this car would do something that almost never happens in the automobile industry. It would genuinely create new demand rather than just shuffling existing buyers between brands. It would pull people who had never owned a car into car ownership. It didn't happen. The motorcycle riders didn't switch to Nanos in the numbers anyone had projected. The price was still high, even at 1 lakh, compared to what a motorcycle cost. A motorcycle was practical in Indian traffic in ways a car was not. A motorcycle could weave between lanes, park anywhere, navigate the chaos of a city street in ways that a four-wheeled vehicle never could. And for buyers who could afford more than a motorcycle, the Nano's social stigma pushed them towards spending a little more for a car with more prestige. The Nano fell into a brutal no-man's land. Too expensive for the truly poor. Too stigmatized for the aspirational middle class. Sales figures. The first 2 fiscal years averaged around 70,000 units annually. By 2016 to 2017, Tata sold just 7,591 Nanos. Not 750,000. Not 75,000. 7,591. In an entire year. In a country of 1.4 billion people. By June 2018, Tata produced exactly 1 Nano. 1 single car. In June 2018, in the factory that had been built to produce 20,000 nanos a month, exactly 1 car rolled off the assembly line. The following month, production stopped entirely. Cyrus Mistry, who briefly served as chairman of Tata Sons before being removed in a dramatic boardroom coup, later confirmed publicly what everyone had suspected. The Nano project had lost money. Significant money. The car had never turned a profit. The whole grand experiment, with all of its patents and innovations and global attention, had been a financial failure. But you have to give Tata credit for one thing. They didn't give up without a fight. In May 2015, 6 years into the Nano's troubled life, Tata Motors introduced what they called the Gen X Nano. A comprehensive refreshed design to address every criticism that customers had leveled at the original. They added a full rear hatchback. No more crawling into the back seat to access the engine. Real trunk access, like a real car. They added an optional automated manual transmission. Not quite an automatic, but close enough that drivers who hated the manual gearbox had an alternative. They added electric power steering on higher trim levels, making the car easier to maneuver in tight city traffic. They added air conditioning, Bluetooth radio, new alloy wheels, better soundproofing, improved interior materials, new colors. They offered 21 different variant combinations, so buyers could configure a Nano that matched their budget and their taste. The Gen X Nano was, by every objective measure, a significantly better car than the original. The fire issues had been addressed. The quality had improved. The features were more competitive with other budget vehicles in the Indian market. And the Indian public remained, overwhelmingly, indifferent. The stigma had set in too deep. The narrative had calcified. The Nano was the poor man's car, and no amount of alloy wheels or Bluetooth connectivity was going to change that story. By 2017, Tata Motors management acknowledged openly what the numbers had been screaming for years. The Nano was not commercially viable. It was not going to turn around. It was finished. And yet, and this is the moment in the story where you have to feel something for these people. When asked if they would discontinue production, Tata Motors' answer was no. Not yet. They said they would continue manufacturing the Nano because of the company's emotional commitment to the project. Emotional commitment. In the cold language of annual reports and investor calls and quarterly earnings presentations, Tata Motors used the word emotional. This was a corporation publicly admitting that it was losing money on a product it was going to keep making anyway, because some things matter more than the balance sheet. Ratan Tata had made a promise to those families on motorcycles. And even after the market had rendered its verdict, even after the financial losses had piled up, even after every rational business argument pointed toward pulling the plug, the company kept making the Nano for one more year. Because a promise is a promise. Production finally ended in May 2018. The Sanand factory retooled and moved on to building other Tata models, the Tiago and the Tiger, slightly larger, slightly more expensive, slightly more successful hatchbacks that occupied the market space the Nano had tried and failed to define. Now, you might be watching this from America and thinking, what does this have to do with me? With my love of classic iron? With my weekend in the garage and my fingers smelling like motor oil and my walls lined with old car magazines? It has everything to do with you. Because Americans have been here before. Not with the Nano specifically, but with the dream of the Nano. The idea of a car for everyone. The idea that the automobile, the most transformative invention of the 20th century, should be accessible to the ordinary person, the working person, the person of modest means who just needs to get from here to there. We had our own version of this dream. His name was Henry Ford. When Henry Ford stood up and declared that he was going to build a car for the great multitude, a car that any man with a decent salary could afford, the established carmakers of 1908 looked at him the same way the automotive world looked at Ratan Tata in 2007. They said it couldn't be done. They said you couldn't build a quality automobile at that price point. They said the mathematics of manufacturing didn't work. Ford proved them wrong. The Model T debuted at $850. That's roughly $30,000 in today's money. Not cheap by any measure, but dramatically, paradigm-shatteringly cheaper than anything comparable. And as production scaled up, the price fell further. By 1925, you could buy a Model T for less than $300. Ford didn't just build a cheap car. He built a revolution. He built an entire industrial philosophy. The moving assembly line, the standardization of parts, the notion that efficiency and volume could unlock price points that the old craft-based manufacturing world could never achieve. The Model T didn't fail. It succeeded beyond anything anyone had imagined. It put America on wheels. It built the suburbs. It changed what it meant to be an American. Ratan Tata read the same history books Henry Ford wrote. He studied the same lessons. He applied the same philosophy. Strip the car down. Standardize the parts. Build for volume. Pass the savings to the consumer. Why did it work for Ford and fail for Tata? Part of the answer is infrastructure. When Ford's Model T appeared, America was a country hungry for automobile transportation and physically capable of absorbing it. The roads were bad, sure. Many were little better than dirt tracks, but the country's geography, its culture, its explosive economic growth, were all pointing toward the automobile as the obvious next step. India in 2008 was different. The roads in major cities were already overwhelmed. Traffic in Mumbai and Delhi had become genuinely paralyzing. Motorcycle culture was deeply embedded, not just economically but socially and practically. India wasn't waiting for the car the way America had been waiting in 1908. Part of the answer is timing. Ford arrived when there was no entrenched car culture, no used car market, no aspirational hierarchy of automobile brands. The Model T became the baseline against which everything else was measured because there was no baseline before it. Tata arrived in a country that already had a car market, already had brands and models, and social hierarchies attached to those brands and models. The Nano wasn't building a new category. It was entering an existing one at the very bottom. And in a world with existing categories, being at the bottom means being stigmatized? Part of the answer is the fire. Ford's Model T caught fire too. Early gasoline-powered cars were genuinely dangerous, and fire incidents were common. But in 1910, there was no social media. There was no viral news cycle. A Model T fire was a local story in a local newspaper. A Nano fire was a global story within hours. The world had changed. The speed of narrative had changed. And the Nano couldn't survive the narrative that formed around those early incidents. The Tata Nano is gone now. You can't buy a new one. The factory that made it has moved on. The production lines have been retooled. The story is over. But the ghost of the Nano lingers in the automotive world, and it will continue to haunt boardrooms and design studios and engineering teams for decades to come. Because the question that drove the Nano hasn't gone away. How do you build truly affordable personal transportation? How do you serve the billions of people on this planet who need to move themselves and their families safely, efficiently, and at a cost they can actually afford? The electric vehicle revolution is, in its own way, wrestling with the same question. Right now, the EV market is largely a luxury market. The average electric vehicle in America costs well over $50,000. The promise of the EV movement, that electric propulsion will eventually bring the cost of transportation down, is the same promise Ratan Tata made about the Nano. The technology will solve the problem. The economies of scale will solve the problem. The ingenuity of engineers given a hard enough challenge will solve the problem. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're not. History says the question is harder than it looks. Ironically, Tata actually showed an electric Nano at the 2010 Geneva Motor Show. A battery-powered version with a claimed range of 80 miles. It never made it to production. The resources needed to develop it alongside everything else the company was trying to do with the car simply weren't there. And there's the other irony. The Nano's raw fuel economy, 60-plus miles per gallon from that tiny two-cylinder engine, was already doing more for fuel efficiency and carbon reduction than many far more celebrated green vehicles. It just wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a Tesla. It didn't have a touchscreen or a frunk or a charging network. It was just a small, light, extremely efficient internal combustion vehicle. And in the world's current energy conversation, nobody wanted to talk about that. Tata was working on other alternative powertrains too. In 2007, they signed an agreement with a French company called Motor Development International to develop a compressed air-powered Nano. An engine that ran on nothing but compressed air, no gasoline, no electricity, no emissions beyond the air it exhaled. The car was projected to travel 200 kilometers on just $3 worth of electricity used to compress the air. By 2009, range was still a significant problem. The compressed air version never made it to market either. There was even a bi-fuel version, the Nano CNG E-Max, launched in October 2013, that could run on either gasoline or compressed natural gas. In cities where CNG was available at fuel stations, it was a genuinely practical, genuinely clean alternative. It delivered 33 horsepower on natural gas and produced significantly fewer emissions than the petrol version. Nobody much cared. The narrative had already been written. The Nano was the poor man's car. The Nano was the car that caught fire. The Nano was the car that failed. And no amount of clever engineering could rewrite that story once it had been told. In the automotive world, we have a complicated relationship with failure. We love the stories of cars that almost made it. The Tucker 48, the DeLorean DMC 12, the Edsel, the Bricklin SV 1. These were cars that arrived with enormous promise, captured public imagination, and then collapsed under the weight of circumstances, bad timing, corporate politics, or simple bad luck. We don't dismiss these cars. We celebrate them. Not because they succeeded, but because they tried. Because behind each of them was a person, Preston Tucker, John DeLorean, Henry Ford II in his misguided way, who looked at the world and said, "I see something that needs to exist, and I'm going to build it." The Tata Nano belongs in that company. Not because it was a great car in the conventional sense. It wasn't, particularly. If you got behind the wheel of a base model Nano today, assuming you could fold yourself into it, you would not be impressed. The brakes are drums all around. There's no power steering on the base model. There are no airbags on any model, ever. The acceleration from 0 to 60 miles per hour takes roughly 30 seconds. The top speed is 65 miles per hour, and you'd need a very long, very empty road and a very patient attitude to get there. By American car standards, it's barely a car at all. But standards are contextual. And in the context of what the Nano was trying to do, in the context of what it would have meant for the millions of families who rode motorcycles through monsoon rains with children on the handlebars, it was something extraordinary. It was an act of empathy expressed in metal and engineering. It was a promise made by a wealthy man to people who had no power and no voice, that their safety and their dignity mattered. It was proof that the automobile, the machine that has always been, at its core, about freedom and possibility and the open road, didn't have to be only for the rich. The 31 design patents and 37 technology patents that the Nano generated didn't disappear when the car stopped rolling off the line. Those innovations are embedded in the record. Other engineers, in other countries, working on other problems, will encounter them. Some of those innovations will show up in future vehicles, maybe in forms nobody can predict yet. The Sanand factory that Narendra Modi helped build to lure Tata Motors from West Bengal is still running. It still builds Tata cars. The investment in Gujarat's industrial infrastructure that the Nano project drove still exists, still employs people, still generates economic activity. The Nano's legacy lives in the ground it broke, even if the car itself doesn't live on the road. And the question Ratan Tata was trying to answer, how do we build a car that everyone can afford, is more urgent today than when he first asked it. Electric vehicles are fighting this battle now. Startups from China are producing small, simple, cheap electric vehicles for urban markets and finding audiences in ways the Nano never did. The Wuling Hongguang Mini EV, a tiny Chinese electric city car, became the best-selling EV in the world for a stretch, at a price point not far removed from what the Nano was attempting. Maybe the lesson was just timing. Maybe the Nano was right about everything except the moment. Ratan Tata retired from active leadership of Tata Sons in 2012. He was 74 years old when he stepped back. In an interview that year, he talked about the Nano with the particular combination of pride and regret that tends to accompany dreams that were real but didn't unfold the way you hoped. He said the car had immense potential in the developing world. He admitted that early opportunities had been lost due to initial problems. He was speaking carefully, the way executives speak in interviews, but the feeling underneath the careful words was readable. He had wanted this for those families on the motorcycles. He had really wanted it. The production line at Sanand built its last Nano in May 2018. The tiny two-cylinder engine, 624 cubic centimeters, 2 cylinders, 38 horsepower, burning gasoline with the quiet efficiency of a machine built by people who couldn't afford to waste anything, turned over for the last time. And the most ambitious, most idealistic, most purely human automotive project of the 21st century's first decade came to an end. Not with a fanfare.
Not with a ceremony. Just a line that stopped. And a promise that almost was.
Here in America, we know what it means to love cars in ways that go beyond logic. We spend money we probably shouldn't on machines that depreciate the moment we drive them off a lot. We restore vehicles that cost more to fix than they'll ever be worth. We drive to car shows just to stand in the sun and look at something beautifully engineered and think about the person who built it and what they were trying to do. We understand, at a level below words, that a car is never just a car. The Tata Nano was never just a car. It was a father's desire to protect his children from the rain and the road. It was an engineer's insistence that nothing is impossible until you've actually tried everything. It was a corporation choosing to honor a promise even after the profit motive had long since vanished. It was 38 horsepower trying to carry the weight of a billion dreams. It didn't make it, but it tried. And in the long, beautiful, tragic history of the automobile, a history built as much on glorious failures as on gleaming successes, that counts for something. That counts for a great deal. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who understands why we tell these stories. The road is long and the history is deep, and every car, even the ones that only sold 7,000 units in their final year, has something to teach us about who we are and what we're reaching for. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one. We go deep on the cars that changed the world, the cars that tried to, and the cars that remind us that engineering is, at its best, an act of hope. Thanks for watching.